So there's some fancy things about Margot. 20 years of experience in coastal systems, the co-lead of the Hackeye Nearshore program and all that stuff. PhD from Oregon State, postdoc at SFU. But I like the personal stuff too. So Margot now lives in Haida Gwaii, has a view of Alaska from across the street, and a wooden boat that as of 2 weeks ago was still floating. So that's good news. And is a really terrific expert on eelgrass systems. And I've had the pleasure of knowing you for a long time, so I'm very excited to have you here. So thank you for coming to share your research today.
Thanks, Chris. And today I'm not going to be talking about seagrass. I'm talking about kelp, of course. You can see that in the title. So thank you so much, ILF, for welcoming me here today. I've been an adjunct here for, I think, about 7 years. And they've asked me kind of every year to give a talk, and this finally worked out. So I'm really glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about kind of the fame that kelp is getting these days across the board, and I'm going to be discussing that in the context of kind of excitement over the ecosystem services that kelp provides, and use some of our long-term data sets from Hackeye to actually help quantify that and then put it in context, and hopefully kind of have some discussions around the future of kelp and other ecosystems on the coast, and how we evaluate their value to us. I also wanted to acknowledge the Haida Nation on whose lands I work. And as Chris said, many of the different First Nations and Indigenous peoples up and down the coast, Hackeye does work really at a very broad scale as well as very locally. So thank you to those partnerships. So as the, let's see, I might not have an actual switcher. Do I have a clicker or something to move things forward? Do I, there? Does that work? Okay, touch screen.
Should be able to do this with your arrows.
Yeah, that's what I just did. Oh, okay. Huh. Maybe I wasn't pressing hard enough. Okay. So yes, kelp is receiving increased global attention. It is very much seen in the scientific literature. So here you can see this kind of dramatic increase in the marine ecological literature since the 2000s. I'm currently part of kind of a global horizon scan project that's done a current meta-analysis of kelp work. And there are 5 times more publications these days compared to the early 2000s. So that's a really rapid increase in research attention. And some of that research attention, as well as what's happening in the fields of aquaculture, kelp production, is also garnering attention in the popular media as well. So if you do a scan in The Guardian for kelp and seaweed, you can see a variety of articles that pop up. So kelp and seaweed are very well represented. If you are someone that follows this, either in the news or in the scientific literature, you're probably being marketed to on social media. And kelp has even made it to the big screen. So here's George Clooney and Julia Roberts rekindling a failed romance at a seaweed farm in Bali. Okay, so one of those Guardian articles coined this phrase, this metaphor for kelp, calling it the Swiss Army knife of the sea. So I don't know if I really like that metaphor, but I think it is apt in terms of the variety of different tools or ecosystem services that it can provide. And so instead of MacGyver to the rescue, this time it's kelp through a variety of different functions and services. So these range from provision of habitat, from top predators, so sea otters, to voracious grazers in those systems, to associated habitats with kelp forests, a variety of fish and invertebrates. I'll be talking a little bit about that. It also includes provision of food directly through seaweed products, and also, well, indirectly through the products or secondary use of kelp. So there's a picture of Louis Drool at a kelp farm in Banfield. And we know culturally that seaweed has been important, especially along our coast for First Nations. They've made use of bull kelp here. There's a picture for millennia and currently have very active FSC fisheries, specifically for roe and kelp. And then we also know that kelp and seaweed can play a role in the ecosystem cycling of nutrients, of regulation of physical processes. So it can buffer the coastline from winter storms, preventing erosion. It can play a role in biogeochemical cycles, especially the carbon cycle, and people have shown that it can mitigate ocean acidification. And it also plays a very substantial role as a photosynthesizer, drawing down carbon and then actively playing a role in remineralization and then potentially in storing that carbon. And so that's the role that's really gaining a lot of attention. And so that role in terms of carbon cycling really has placed kelp and marine biomass production in the realm of other solutions that are being envisioned to mitigate emissions globally. And these, often called blue carbon because they're near shore, in the water, blue solutions to climate change have been analyzed and looked at and kind of assessed in terms of their risks. And they're very much the lower risk or lower cost strategies for carbon dioxide removal. Another piece of jargon, CDR, net is another one, negative emission technologies. All these really encapsulate kind of our understanding of these in their role in climate mitigation. And so this function in terms of the biogeochemical regulatory service has garnered kind of some interesting allies. Everyone from pretty hardcore environmentalists to techno billionaires. And then I'm not sure if this is safe, so we'll go really quickly through this slide, but even Musk was in on the action, but this is so 2022 when he funded an X Prize for carbon dioxide removal. So we know we're gaining an understanding of these functions, these services around kelp. So the attention is very well deserved, I think. But kelp remains underrepresented in global governance regimes and institutions. So this is kind of a scan of literature, reports from the IUCN, from UNEP, and global environmental funds. And you can see it's much lower than some of these other habitats and those other blue carbon ecosystems in terms of actually being mentioned in those reports. So it's much lower than the tropical species, mangroves and corals, and then also lower than seagrass and salt marsh, which are also in along temperate coastlines. So contextually, we know these ecosystems are important for us, but we also, oops. We also know that kelp has been declining globally. And so that's another reason why it's getting more attention these days. So this is kind of the most recent global analysis of kelp data. It's dated now from 2016, but they came up with an average loss rate around the world of around 2%. And you can see from this map, there's a lot of red, but there's also a lot of blue on this map. So red are areas where kelp has been declining, but blue are areas where kelp has been either stable or increasing. Across those sites where we have long-term data sets, we know that 40 to 60% of kelp forests have been seen to have declines. So kelp is threatened, but what if we zoom in on our coast into North America, but especially along the Northeast Pacific coast? Here you can see that there, again, is a mix of red and blue. So there's large declines, very substantial declines that have been reported and observed for a number of reasons in Northern California. If you move up the coast to the Pacific Northwest, in this picture, there is primarily blue. Again, this was data from 2016. And so the most kind of recent snapshot of trends from British Columbia also captures some of the variability that you can see across this region. So areas of decline, again, in red as you move from north to south, but also large areas of stability in light blue, and even areas of gains in dark blue here. And those are often associated with areas where sea otters are recovering into the system. So at Hackeye, we've been doing kelp forest monitoring for about 10 years now. Our research takes place in 2 locations. One of those is on the central coast of British Columbia and Calvert Island. This is in Awikano and Heiltsuk territory. And that's where the bulk of our long-term time series across a number of different kelp forest sites occurs. We also have work on Quadra Island, both in the field monitoring, but that's also the site where we have a lot of really focused work in our labs on experimental work. And it's also kind of a test bed for some of the monitoring techniques that we end up using on Calvert or throughout the rest of the coast. And so this work is also connected to global initiatives for long-term ecological research. So we work with Marine Geo, with the Smithsonian, and as a part of that project, we're responsible for looking at trends and assessing drivers for 3 ecosystem types: rocky intertidal, kelp forests, and seagrass. Alyssa Gaiman is my co-lead with Hackeye and focuses on the rocky intertidal side of things. So for each one of those habitats, we do annual surveys. We've done seasonal surveys in the past, and I'll be talking about some of that data. And we look at metrics of productivity, of biodiversity, of connectivity. So connectivity between these habitats, but also between land and sea in this area. And all this work is paired with environmental data. And as I mentioned, because we're part of this larger network and group, we're often conducting really focal studies or experiments at these sites. And so those time series, especially thinking about productivity and diversity, can be used to look at ecosystem services. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll be talking about 2 specific functions and those services that they provide. And I'll be illustrating this with comparisons between bull kelp and giant kelp. These are the dominant canopy-forming species along our coast. Bull kelp Nereocystis, I often call it Nereo as a short form, and giant kelp Macrocystis is often called Macro as a short form. And you can see on that kind of range extent diagram on the far side over there that they overlap from Alaska down to Southern California, but Nereo extends further north. It's an annual species, and Macro extends further south, and it's a perennial species. So I hope that sets the scene. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about productivity. And specifically, productivity with regard to biogeochemical cycles, focusing in here again on carbon cycles in particular. So we know that coastal habitats, those ones that I illustrated, seagrass, marsh, mangrove systems, can play a role in climate mitigation. We often refer to them as blue carbon ecosystems again. They can draw down and mitigate carbon dioxide emissions, and the process of doing that is often referred to as providing a natural climate solutions, or NCS. Again, there's a lot of jargon in this landscape, so I'm hoping to illustrate some of those words throughout. So there's been some global assessments. Here's one by McCready et al. To really capture and quantify these habitats and put them in perspective to other types of emissions reductions. And from this, they come up with a global emission offset of about 3% per year. So that's not a huge slice of the pie, but we know that there are many different pieces of that portfolio to reduce global carbon emissions. So it is nonetheless quite important. And it's akin to about the value 3.3% associated with landfill and wastewater emissions. So you might think, what about seaweed and kelp? Why isn't it here? Why isn't it captured? And that is largely because seaweed and kelp in particular are a little bit harder to quantify, because the biomass produced by that habitat isn't stored locally. So these systems grow primarily on rocky reefs. Carbon can't be buried there. It's either exported to other areas, to deep sea areas where it can potentially be stored for longer periods of time, or it can end up onshore. And along the way, there's a lot of different recycling of carbon as it goes. It can decay, it can continue to photosynthesize and to respire. So there are some complexities as we think about carbon stocks in the environment actually being stored. And I just wanted to show this diagram to show how complex these cycles really are. This is from a review by Ross et al. That really goes through and illustrates all the pathways for KELP in terms of climate solutions. So to date, most of the information that's actually been assembled to actually calculate or quantify the value associated with seaweeds is from estimates, from modeling estimates based on aquaculture scenarios. So there's some global models and estimates that have been produced, and then we have one that came out last year from British Columbia. And all of these models show that the terms associated with productivity of production of kelp are very sensitive. So we really wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail from our local time series and place-based work on Calvert Island. So to quantify a natural climate solution, you need first off information on the spatial extent, as well as the spatial extent of the habitat, as well as the carbon storage associated with it. And often the bulk of that carbon is stored in the sediment. So that's a picture of a core for soft sediment systems. People go out and take cores and measure the carbon quantity there. And so multiplying spatial extent by carbon storage gives you kind of a carbon storage potential. Then to actually understand its role in natural climate solutions, you have to roll it through these various different climate mitigation pathways. And so the pathways that are often evaluated include mitigating loss of habitat, so conservation, for example, or restoring a specific habitat. And then for seaweed, we often think about product replacement or using a lower emission value kelp form, which can have an effect on the total carbon value. So if you lower the carbon footprint, or if you reduce emissions, this can be considered a natural climate solution. And the example most often cited for that is, feeding cows or ruminants a seaweed, and then that lowers potentially their methane reductions. So these natural climate solutions really need to be evaluated. They need to be non-status quo. So that means they need to have kind of an additive effect over background conditions or some sort of control in order to prove that they're really having an impact of value on climate mitigation. So I'm not going to focus too much on the pathway side of things here, but that is the context for this. I will talk a little bit more about how we put together this information to get these total carbon storage potential estimates. So our kelp mapping program on the central coast of BC is led by Luba Rashitnik. We use a number of different platforms for collecting data on the extent of kelp across different scales. So at local scales, we use drones. At regional scale, so within the Central Coast or even within the northern bioregion of British Columbia, we use a combination of fixed-winged airplanes and high-resolution satellites. And then coast-wide to kind of capture what's happening at the scale of British Columbia as a whole, we're using other types of satellite platforms. And all of these technologies platforms are nested, and we use the data from one to validate the next. This information can be used by managers, and the choice of tools really depends on your management questions. And so Luba has brought together a group of people, a community of practice up and down the coast, and they've produced this canopy forming guidebook map. So if you're interested in that, check out this resource. It's handy to figure out what tool is best for the job. And in addition to the remote sensing work that we do, we often also collect sometimes paired, sometimes offset metrics in the field. So this can be surface-based metrics from kayaks or boats, or at Hackeye, we do a lot of subtidal work. I should say that the surface-based metrics, we work closely with MAP, which is the Marine Area Partnership for the North Pacific Coast. And they're the ones that are really responsible for the boat-based metrics, but they also do a lot of drone based work to capture kind of the extent of kelp in the area. We've worked closely with them to develop really accessible methods for that. So and those methods don't only include going out and flying your drone, but they also include data processing. So this is a kelpomatic tool that's popping in and out here. You can see the red that's being highlighted. Those are kelp polygons that are actually derived from this AI-based segmentation tools. So this is very accessible. Now guardians can, as I said, go out in the morning, collect information, bring it back and extract information on extent at the end of the day. So what does this actually, when you use these various tools and bring it all together, what does information on changes in kelp extent actually look like? So on the left is a spatial map of change in kelp extent at one site, Trickett Island, through time. And then on right, that's a quantification of the change through time. Disregard any differences between red and blue there. Those are just different methods. The main takeaway from this figure is really the substantial increase that you see from 2016 to 2017, 2018. That represents a doubling in kelp extent. And at this site, that was associated with some very strong biological drivers, namely sea otters moving into this area. At the time, sea stars were also very present. All of those things consume urchins, which regulate kelp. And so if we move on to 2019 through 2021 here, you can see that the numbers go back down. And that's because sea otters have moved on along the coast, and because there was a sea star wasting disease that caused some severe declines in those populations. So you can see that these, in terms of extent alone, kelp populations can be very dynamic. We also know that there's strong environmental drivers regulating these systems. And here's some information, here's some kind of a sneak peek at that type of variation from a recent publication by Ondine Pontier, who leads our kelp forest field team. From these graphs on the left, these are blade growth rate parameters, which are a proxy measurement from productivity. You can see that they're very high at the beginning of every season, and then they decline throughout the summer months. And they go down to almost zero at the end of the summer. And that's because these are from Nereo populations, so it's an annual, so they die off at the end of the year. And I just wanted to make note again that there's some substantial differences between years and also between sites here. And our analysis showed that that both temperature and nutrients were responsible for these changes through time. We know from other areas like California that these parameters are often very strongly coupled with strong upwelling events, but interestingly, in this area of the Central Coast, they were often decoupled throughout the summer growing season. So it was either one or the other, but often not both, that could limit the growth of kelp in these waters. So to understand, there we go, to collate information on carbon storage, the other element that's needed for those natural climate solutions. Uh-oh, we've lost our slide. As I mentioned, we do a lot of scuba-based work. So we have annual scuba surveys led by Ondine that measure a variety of different parameters. Great, including density, height, growth, and then once annually, we also go out and actually measure individual kelp plants. And so you can see from this picture of two very large Nereocystis plants. They're about 8 people long, which is pretty impressive. And from that information, we collect a bunch of different morphometric information. We dry elements of the plant to get wet-dry relationships. We send it away for percent carbon and carbon isotope analysis. And so when you can use this data collectively to develop relationships and actually derive a value of kelp carbon per area from this. So given those high spatial and seasonal variation that I've kind of illustrated through some examples, in those two parameters, kelp extent and kelp productivity, we were interested in understanding how variable kelp carbon is. Is it different between those two species, Nereo and macro? And what might the implications of that be for natural climate solutions assessments? So here's some of our time series through 3 years where we did seasonal surveys. This is for macrocystis kelp. You can see that there's summer peaks at around 300 grams carbon per meter squared. There are substantial differences here between sites. They range from 50 to 300. And I did want to note here that I'm talking about production here really as the standing stock through time as a metric of productivity. We have other work that's getting at net primary productivity in more refined detail as well. Oops. Trying to go back one slide. Okay. This is just to illustrate that macrocystis grows right from the substrate to the surface of the water column. Is a very structurally complex habitat. So one might assume that it would have greater carbon potential than Nereocystis, which grows primarily at the surface. It's on a long, very long stipe from the substrate to the surface, and the blades are primarily at the surface. And indeed, the biomass and carbon associated with Nereocystis is substantially lower. So about half, the peak values are about half that of macrocystis, around 150 grams carbon per meter squared. You can see that there's not quite as much variability between these Nereosites as there was between macrosites, but there is a large amount of interannual variability that was observed here. And so overall, Nereocystis carbon was much lower than macrocystis carbon, but there was some site specificity to this. So thinking about carbon storage potential, here's just a very kind of back of the envelope calculation with 2 scenarios for spatial extent and standing stock to give us kind of an upper and a lower bound for these estimates. So if we look at kind of the differences in spatial extent between the years where we saw very low versus very high values, and then if we use our standing stock values for Nereo compared to macrocystis, we get these results for carbon storage potential that show that kind of the upper bound can be 4 times greater than the lower bound. And as you recall, I mentioned previously that those models that are looking at carbon storage potential, they've illustrated that the productivity term can be highly sensitive. And I think this kind of shows that here. It also, of course, is really important when we're thinking about how to actually evaluate local projects that are purporting to mitigate climate. So to summarize this section, kelp is highly productive, grows very fast. It has the potential to contribute to climate change mitigation. But the strengths of this function really is driven by species-specific and local variation. And I think I've illustrated that with a couple of examples here. The pathways that I talked about for natural climate solutions associated with kelp, so conservation, restoration, low carbon, and emissions replacement, those are currently being resolved through kind of the global community of practice and researchers. And there's been many knowledge gaps identified and work on that's being done in order to validate those kelp carbon pathways. And so here's some to kind of illustrate what some of those major knowledge gaps are. This is a picture that illustrates some of the major risks associated with seaweed farming from a publication by Ross et al. And just overlaid in that in bold, I wanted to illustrate just some of the major knowledge gaps and some of the stuff that we're working on with Hackeye. So the kind of understanding of carbon dioxide dynamics between the atmospheric realm and the aqueous form, that's kind of an active area of research. And here, number one, the risk really shows that potentially there could even be some negative emissions associated with kelp productivity. So even emissions of CO2 that occurs. And so lots of people are thinking about what does this air-sea flux dynamics really look like across all blue carbon ecosystems. I mentioned at the very start that transport, our understanding of kelp transport and the remineralization processes is a little bit still of a black box. And so people are doing a variety of different studies and work to look at that. But it's really important to think about from the perspective of, could methane be released during some of those decay processes? Could there be hypoxic events associated with kelp decomposition at depth, which some groups are actually trying to do as a means to mitigate carbon? And then also in those sink locations, how do you actually validate kelp and where it comes from? So people are actively developing markers, genetic markers to validate that. Okay, just a little pause here while we transition to diversity. Okay, so for this next section, I'll be talking about our diversity time series and how it relates to the provision of biodiversity by these habitats. And this is work led by Ondine Pontier and Alex Schmel, who's now a master's student here today. This is this is a compilation of data sets across our kelp forest monitoring sites, which include sites that are health-tick monitoring sites. So you can see this is a fairly large kind of latitudinal gradient from north to south here. South is around Calvert Island, and then further north is up closer to Bella Bella and health-tick territory. So this includes, again, a kind of comparison of macrocystis and nereocystis. We have 10 macro sites, 8 nereosites, and this is 6 years worth of data. And the first thing that's pretty interesting is that, there's a high number of species associated with these habitats. So over 89 identified species of fish, and also many unidentified species. And then 59 identified species of invertebrates. So this range from species including sea cucumbers to crabs to sea urchins, sea stars, other bivalves and gastropods. And so first off, we just wanted to look at purely how do these two habitats compare in terms of diversity. So on the left is diversity of fish, on the right, diversity of invertebrates. And that you can see here, what you can see here is that for fish, there is a significant difference. There's some overlap, but this is a significant trend between nereo and macro sites. But for invertebrates, we don't see these differences. And this might be what we expect. Again, fish are often, dispersed throughout the water column. So the structural differences between those habitats could play a role. Whereas invertebrates, many of these are benthic invertebrates. So the canopy itself might not structure these communities as much. I also wanted to, what did I want to do? I also wanted to make note that we also did another analysis, very similar, looking at these sites in a very paired way. So sites that were really close together and revisited during 14 years, and these sites still held. These trends still held very strongly. In fact, they were even stronger. So what does this mean in terms of composition of the communities of the fish and invertebrate communities? How do those differ between these two habitats? There is a lot of overlap you can see between these two habitat types, but there's also a lot of differences between these two. And we wanted to look at the role of site itself versus habitat in accounting for some of the variability that we saw here. So Alex and Ondine ran a Permanova, and for fish, the habitat variability associated with this was much lower than the amount accounted for by site. For invertebrates, it was lower again for habitat compared to site, but not as markedly so. So overall, sites explain differences in the communities better than habitat. So habitat is important, but also environmental differences between these sites is very important. We also wanted to look at what species were most responsible for driving some of these trends. So don't look at the differences here, but just think of the kind of multi-dimensional space, ordination space here captured in these two habitats. For fish, you can see that they overlap fairly substantially. There's some differences that are largely driven by differences in rockfish or by some specific species. If we think about invertebrates, however, there's some overlap in that space, but we can also see that there's some key species differences there. So abalone in particular drives some of those trends for Nereo, and then for Macrocystis, some of that is driven by changes in specific sea star species, as well as the red turban snail, so a snail species. That's interesting, and this very data set was also used in a global analysis that evaluated the economic value associated with these ecosystem services. This was led by Aaron Eager. And so from this analysis, we found that Nereocystis was much greater value-wise than Macrocystis. And again, this was largely driven by that large bar there is the market value associated with abalone. And then next up, sea cucumbers and also fish and sea urchins were responsible for that kind of ecological value. So that's interesting along our coast. Abalone doesn't currently have a market value. We're prohibited from harvesting it right now. It's protected, but potentially in terms of thinking about this globally, the kind of total value associated with those systems is really great because of those species. This analysis also compared the value between fisheries and the carbon uptake value and found that the fisheries value was much greater. And so lots of people are thinking about this right now, the kind of economic or ecosystem trade-offs between these different types of services. And I hope this illustrates that here. So to summarize this section, KELP supports diverse communities. It can contribute to fisheries and other ecosystem services, and it very much varies by dominant kelp forest species and the individual species that exist within those systems. Okay, so to summarize in general, 2 vignettes that show the links between our long-term time series and ecosystem service assessments or values. How is this information actually useful? How can it be applied? And so to illustrate that, one example is using this information for ecosystem service validation. People talk a lot about developing frameworks for MMRV or measuring, monitoring, reporting, and validation. So here's kind of just one example, potential framework, very basic. If we want to evaluate a specific climate mitigation or biodiversity projects, for instance, kelp restoration, we need some understanding or oversight of that project to understand if what they're doing is really real. So often that relies on a broader suite of data, of information. And so project-specific data can be sent to kind of a larger data lake or of combined models that can use long-term data sets such as ours, because individual projects aren't necessarily going to have the background information that's really necessary to go through those project pathway evaluations. But you need that in order to provide information back to a reporting organization to report out and to validate and assess the project. So this is kind of high level, showcasing the role that those time series or information monitoring can play in evaluating specific projects. Okay, I know I'm a little slow, but I really only have 2 slides to go. And I'm kind of ending there, but I did want to showcase some of the other kelp work that HACI is doing that often informs some of the monitoring and research work we do. So we work really closely with our ocean observation team. They're going to be doing some new work on air-sea flux, as I mentioned. We've also done some work looking at the question of ocean acidification and refugia capacity for kelp forests. We have a project based at UBC, and people in the room are part of that, leading some of those projects. looking at different tools for monitoring biodiversity in kelp forests, and specifically looking at the successional dynamics within those forests. So we're going to be deploying these arms, structural platforms, as well as Laura and Colleen and others are leading some microbial work in our group. Hackeye also does a lot of eDNA work, and often this is in partnership with community groups. So we've been looking at fish, eDNA up and down our coast, and we have a specific project with Hessing to look at eDNA in kelp forests and other habitat types. And then on Quadra Island specifically, we've been doing some more experimental work looking at eDNA in the field to look at the early life history of some of these species of their gametophyte bank. And we'll be doing more biobanking associated with this in the future. And then when we think about this ecosystem service associated with provision and human food products, we have a new project just getting going at UBC. Rashid is involved, as well as Patrick, Sandra Lindstrom, myself, people at Bamfield, to establish a new international bioeconomy macroalgae center at UC Berkeley to bring people together around the coast and talk about all these emerging technologies and ways that kelp is being used as a product, both as food as well as other products like biofuels. And then finally, we are actively engaged in communications and partnerships with our neighbors up and down the coast, but particularly in Washington State. So we have a group called the Kelp Node that meets very regularly to discuss all things kelp. If anyone's interested in joining in this room, everyone is welcome. And this really follows a knowledge to action framework. So we're doing stuff on the ground that can lead to some real management policy actions. And then finally, Hackeye does a lot of community partnered science. So this picture kind of illustrates some of the work we've done, some of the trainings we've done with Guardian Watchman programs in the past. That work is very much ongoing. We're creating tailored programs for really specific projects. And then we also do a lot around data mobilization. So on the right is an example of a webinar that we did this fall. We're going to be doing more of that, and more of that is going to be focused on kelp within the next year. So how do we actually bring our data to bear? So I hope that provides kind of an overview of kelp, that kelp research, kelp in general, everything kelp. Many thanks to a large group of scientists and collaborators. And I just wanted to say specifically, Alyssa, this is a Hackeye double bill. So I'm going today, and then next week, Alyssa Gaiman will also be speaking. And thanks everyone for coming out.
Have a little bit of time left for questions for our speaker, if anyone has questions for Margot.
Do I get to ask? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, go for it.
and just if you could briefly summarize it for people online, can't hear people that are quieter than me.
Sure.
With all the research into the net benefits, however you define it, of different species, are there do some organization have plans for sort of, I don't know what you would call it, re-ecological engineering to supplant certain species that might be native in the past with other species that might be viewed as better in certain areas?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, I spoke a lot about differences between species, but is there interest in using other species, potentially ones that aren't there currently, or maybe have been in the past, or maybe are new to the system, new arrivals, and using those to provide a specific function? I think this is, definitely an active area of discussion, especially where it comes to restoration ecology. In the context of kelp, people have, I just heard last week at a symposium, people talking about sargassum that's moving into our coast. Of course, it's a huge issue in the tropics and the Caribbean, but there has also been a lot of work around its carbon carbon mitigation potential. So people are interested in that. I think it's a little bit, it's definitely controversial on our coast, because if you have a new species that comes into the system, it will likely displace something that was there. Andrea.
Following on that question, great talk, but rockweed comes to mind as being something that's everywhere that seems to do really well in nearby high temperature waters.
Yeah.
Are there any plans to quantify its carbon capture potential?
Right. Yeah. So for online, Andrea was asking about the about rockweed, because it is ubiquitous. It's all over our coast. Are people looking into it specifically? Yeah, I think so too. I agree with you. I mean, like, it's kind of the lowly rockweed question. You know, actually, I think Chris and I had some conversations about this a couple of weeks ago. But it would be interesting to start off and look at it, just a full quantification of the basics, like the extent and the biomass of rockweed that we see along our coast in rocky systems and in soft sediment systems, to start our understanding of that. I agree. There's a lot of it, and it sometimes weathers the storms quite nicely. Some other times it doesn't do well with stress. William. Oops.
So, the last features in KELP culture, is there any discussions about governance of this environment? Because there are also uncertainty with this project. You also mentioned about wondering discussion where there is anything about the governance of how to manage and develop
KELP agriculture. Yeah. Okay. So the question is about where are things at in terms of kind of regulatory frameworks around KELP aquaculture. Are you talking about in British Columbia or in British Columbia? Yeah. Yeah, so in British Columbia, the regulatory organization around KELP is the province, and then there's I haven't interacted with them too much, but there's an aquaculture body around that as well. And so there are very current conversations about regulating where you're getting the seed stock for KELP from, just in order to be precautionary and not mix kind of the genetics. There's a lot of people actively looking at the genetics, so that can actually be an informed discussion. In terms of actual kind of targets for KELP aquaculture and KELP growth in British Columbia, and if there's like a management strategy for that, I would say no, but that could be developed under the coastal marine strategy that the province is leading. It's not under DFO currently at all, but people, just last week, there was a BC KELP symposium, so people are actively talking about that really the province and DFO, the feds, need to come together for some sort of management framework around that. Right now, it's a bit of a we just don't really have any real management kind of power around KELP.
I was interested in the work that you presented on estimating the extent of the two KELP species that you study, which are canopy upward floating ones.
Yes.
Where drone or air stuff is, you are able to map that.
Yes.
Someone who studies distributed KELPs.
Yeah.
And predicting where they are distributed is much harder.
Right.
So wondering, is there any research being done looking at maybe the association between where you have the canopy growing, what other not more Bentley growing growing at the bottom, and if there's any kind of ability to predict how much, lower canopy.
Right.
Is related to this one.
Yeah.
Help us understand, because there's so much more kelp down there.
Yeah.
Not just the canopy.
Right. Yes.
I don't know.
Great question. Yeah, no, so the question was, okay, well, what about the subcanopy and are there relationships between the subcanopy and the canopy forming kelps? And this actually, I was supposed to mention that, of course, this work totally excluded mention of the subcanopy. And I feel like lots of people that are doing, I mean, we're doing the canopy mapping work because it's the only thing you can actually see from the surface with our current technologies. And there is, I think, acknowledgement across the full community, that's the subtidal community of seaweeds and other kelps really matters, of course. In terms of those relationships, I think people are interested in that and have probably like looked at it. I don't know about any publications. Our group is certainly interested in that and has the data set to kind of compare what's at the surface with what's underneath. And we've been talking about that in terms of associated species of fish and inverts as well. But active work on this front is being done using species distribution models. So you're probably aware of that they're modeling not only canopy forming kelps, but other seaweed species. And so with those data sets, you could look at those relationships more directly.
One last question.
Colette?
Thank you, Margot, for it's great. I had one quick observation, which I thought was quite interesting, your graph about when you had the otters move in and then move back out, that there seems to be an equilibrium there. We came back to what it was in 2016, so I thought that was interesting. But then my question is, what is driving the productive or like the production differences? So the gram C per meter squared for the species where the differences were so high. So what kind of environmental parameters really drive those differences? Since you said that it's environmental parameters that seem to be driving them.
In terms, so the question was around some of like what's driving some of the kelp carbon.
The gram C per meter squared differences that you
Yeah. Between years or between
sites.
Between sites. Oh, right. Okay. And so we didn't get into that in great detail, but definitely, you know, the suite of environmental conditions. I talked about nutrients and temperature, but there's also differences in terms of the, you know, the depth and the light availability at any one site. And then also other factors such as currents that can really drive some of those differences between sites. So that paper by Ondine also looks at some of the other variables across those sites and what's really driving things, but nutrients and temperature really do come out as tops. Yeah. Rashid, one quick question for Rashid.
Super fast.
Yeah, thank you for your passion. Since I met you, it's amazing when she's talking about cat. It's like, oh my, so thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now you had California rise. Maybe you want to answer this question. Why do you think California is on the rise? I want to be restricted dialogue. I may say it's because of picking all the fish, so everybody is talking about kelp. Why is that? Are we fishing down another field?
Yeah, so Rashid says, why this focus on kelp, and is it because we're no longer interested in well, not that we're no longer interested, we don't have as many fish, so now we're stuck with kelp and some lowly bivalves filter feeding. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I would say that's interesting talking to people that have been in this field for a long time, that there's been kind of cycles and some cyclicity to people's interest in seaweed and kelp. And so, you know, like in the 70s and the 80s, there was also a big boon, and the government of BC actually was responsible for a province-wide monitoring of kelp forests because they wanted to support emerging industries, and so that didn't go anywhere, obviously. And then so now there's another wave right now here, and I think the climate function definitely piqued people's interests, but there has been a lot of critical analysis of that that's come out in the last year or so, and so people are quickly like moving on to biodiversity. And thinking about that. It's also, you know, I think it's a happy picture, kelp, right? But it's a happy picture up to a point, and so a lot of people discuss kind of the scale issue. If we have kelp, if we end up planting kelp along our entire coast, do we want that? Or do we want to just focus on trying to figure out how to restore some specific areas where we've seen declines? Thanks, everyone.